Hey, I'm Pastor Quincy, and I'm here to welcome you to our study guide for episode 8 of season 2 of The Chosen. And this episode is about the Sermon on the Mount. So The Chosen is a free TV series. You can download the free Chosen app. You can find old episodes on YouTube. Make sure that you look at the description of this episode for that and other helpful links. All right, so the first thing we see in this episode is a conversation between two people and a landowner that we don't know. So spoilers, in case you haven't seen this episode, please go watch the episode before you watch the rest of this video. We discover that one of the folks who is buying this land is Judas, later to be known as Judas Iscariot. So Judas and the man that he's working with, who kind of is the chief negotiator, are selling this guy on getting rid of his property because it's worthless, and they're going to cut tombs in it for middle-class families. But actually, secretly, we discover they know that there's salt there, and they're going to bring in salt miners and make a tidy profit here. At the beginning of this episode, the landowner is nervous about selling it because it's been in this family for years, and when hears the idea of drawing up the covenants to sell the land, he's reminded, he says, of Abraham, the covenant that God made with Abraham to give him this promised land. You can find that in Genesis chapter 15, verses 1 through 18. It's great how the show brings in those covenants, those nature of God's chosen people ideas into this whole concept. And I love that scene in Genesis 15 because God has his presence pass between halves of the animals that Abraham sacrifices, and God saying, I'm going to keep my covenant with you even if it means that I have to be torn apart, which of course we see Jesus is the fulfillment of that for God. Jesus is torn apart to keep covenant with his people, and Judas someday plays a big role in that. So all that is being foreshadowed for us in this scene. We see the disciples who are still kind of nervous and anxious and fighting a little bit about how to set up for the Sermon on the Mount, do the task that Jesus has asked them to do to get the word out about the sermon that he's going to do, and find a location for it. I thought it was interesting that John tells Simon that his exercise smacks of Hellenism. Of course, the Greeks were known to exercise, were known to be into the games, and Jews weren't really supposed to be into that kind of thing, so a little reference to that here. And John's just kind of jealous of Simon's physique, I think. You see Peter refer to James as Big Thunder, those names that Jesus gave James and John as the sons of thunder are referenced here. And Philip points out that John used to heckle the Pharisees, so if they show up to Jesus' sermon, maybe Jesus will do the same thing. And that's a reference to Matthew chapter 3, verses 7 through 10, where you get to see John heckle the Pharisees and call them brood of vipers and tell them that they don't have things together. We see Rama continuing to learn scripture under Mary, who's working on some leaflets and flyers for the Sermon on the Mount. Mary is translating Psalm 139, verse 5, Rama is translating Psalm 139, verse 5, and Mary Magdalene is kind of dealing with some of the lingering feelings that she has about having wandered from Jesus and trying to trust herself and her trust of Jesus. We see Tamar, the Ethiopian woman who has joined the group, and she is with Mother Mary, and they're talking about what is going on with Jesus and his disciples. Thomas says the disciples fighting is love, and it kind of reminds me of how I'll joke with my guy friends, those kind of things, but you still love each other, and that's kind of how you express it, and that's how Thomas seems to be here. And Thomas also references his affection for Rama here and how he wants Tamar to let her know that he's particularly got her the apricots. Continuing theme that'll be important to keep track of as the show goes on. We go back to Judas and his friend who are in business together. His friend says that they are they're better than Sophocles and Euripides and Aeschylus, who are famous Greek dramatists, writers, and famous in the theater realm for Greece. So those are references that he makes there. But Judas is having some issues of conscience and having taken this land from the man at such a bargain price. And he references that there's only one true king in heaven and that every human being will become dust. Judas has a real clear concept of death, which is interesting. Referencing back to that field being a place for tombs, they talk about how middle-class families don't want to bury their parents in paupers' graves, and that is kind of foreshadowing of what happens to Judas eventually as well, as his body ends up in a potter's field and a poor place for bodies to go. But Judas here, when he talks about men becoming dust, kind of a reference here to Psalm 103 verses 13 through 15, that whole concept of God being the king, people becoming dust, and it's his mindfulness of us that brings us value. I notice that Judas is sensitive when it's brought up that he's an orphan, and the show wants you to notice that Judas has that experience in his past, and maybe that is somewhat what drives him to, as he says, do something that really matters and will make sure that he's remembered. And there's foreshadowing there, of course, because we know that Judas is remembered. We see, for not reasons that he probably wants, we see Nathaniel and James, the less, and Thaddeus out looking for the right place for the Sermon on the Mount to happen. They find an unfriendly shepherdess out there with the sheep at a place they think is perfect. The place that they find and the description they're looking for sounds very similar to the Chorazim Plateau, which if you go to Israel is where they'll take you and say this is the traditional place for the Sermon on the Mount, which makes sense. Beautiful view of the Sea of Galilee up on top of a hill where people can gather all around, and there's a large plateau there where people can hear Jesus. And then the description of the beautiful trees also describes pretty well what's up there. So I like that connection that the show made, and they've used the landscape to the best potential that they have there. We go back briefly to Shmuel and his friend who are with now Shammai. And, we talked a little bit before about how there's those two basic schools of rabbinical thought, Hillel and Shammai. Rivals right now. Hillel's grandson Shimon is leading the school of Hillel. Hillel more in line with Jesus' philosophy of be about the spirit of the law, which is the love of God and love for each other. Shammai more about the letter of the law. The show is presenting Shammai here in sort of a pretty villainous light, which I'm not necessarily quite on board with, but certainly Jesus has a lot of criticism for those who live more by the Shammai way of looking at things. They reference, again, Daniel 7:13 through 14, Jesus claiming the Son of Man title for himself. They go through all of Jesus' offenses. Women are among his followers. Some of them are women of ill repute. He's got Gentiles that he associates with, and the Zealots, the fourth philosophy, those who are into armed rebellion against Rome. And Shammai lays out this plan. They're going to continue to gather evidence about Jesus, continue to make it known to all those who would be interested what Jesus is doing that goes against religious and cultural norms, and then eventually reveal that Shimon and Nicodemus and those of the school of Hillel ignored Jesus, and then when Jesus becomes a problem, everyone will condemn Shimon and Hillel, and their house will fall, he says. And interesting, Shmuel says, that's not really what I want. I just want to stop Jesus from continuing to do what he's doing. And Shammai says, oh yeah, of course, that's what it is that we want. We go back to Jesus talking to Matthew. They're talking through the Sermon on the Mount. So if you want to know where these scriptures come from that Jesus references here and that Matthew talks through, you look at Matthew chapter 5 and through Matthew chapter 7. 5, 6, and 7 will give you all the things that Matthew describes here. If you look, you'll notice that Matthew says Jesus is starting off with the parable of the salt of the earth. And they talk through the whole meaning of salt. They reference the Punic Wars between Carthage and Rome, and how Rome salted the earth, and how people might think about that. And Jesus is thinking of salt in a different way. It's preserving, renewing, and healing qualities. Now, if you notice, salt of the earth doesn't show up till after the Beatitudes. So we're immediately shown that Jesus is still developing the concept of the Beatitudes. Interesting note, Jesus says, I'm not here to tell people easy things, because Matthew says you've got a lot of bad news and not a lot of good news. So should you maybe have some more good news? And Jesus says, I'm not interested in making things easy for people. I'm here to start a revolution. And Matthew says, well, love your enemies doesn't sound like a revolution. And Jesus says, it's not a revolt, it's a revolution. It's a transforming the way that we look at the world and the way that we think about ourselves in relationship with God. Love how the show went through that for us to show that Jesus is not here for a violent revolution. He's here to change people's hearts and minds in the way that they go about life. And he says these things will make sense to some and not to others, which sort of sounds like what he says in Matthew 13 when he talks about the parables to his disciples, saying, hey, not everybody's going to get this. And he references the idea of peering deeply into the law, which to me reminds me of James chapter 1, verse 25, where James talks about looking deeply into the law, looking deeply into God's word. And I think that's great. I love the show bringing in some concepts of James into Jesus' mouth. They are brothers. I think the show probably isn't going to present them as necessarily brothers, maybe stepbrothers in some sense, which is fine, because we want to welcome all Catholics who maybe see that a little bit differently than Protestants into watching this show as well. But having this concept from James show up on Jesus' lips, I liked a lot. Now, Judas and his friends show back up briefly, selling the landowner on the idea of having the sermon on his land so that he can sell products to people who associate his land with it. And then we see the disciples handing out the leaflets, telling people about the sermon, and we see Quintus briefly upset about it. Atticus is laughing, but there's a sermon going on. Atticus and Gaius are going to go there and keep an eye on things, but Quintus is upset. Jesus hasn't really paid attention when he said, "Don't cause any trouble." This is possibly some trouble for him to think about. The disciples are back together. They're getting ready for this. I thought it interesting that Rama said, "Can Jesus get anything wrong?" Jesus also says to his mom, "Hey, I might mess up my sermon. Don't say you're proud of me yet till you hear it." I love how the show shows you that Jesus can make mistakes. He doesn't sin. He doesn't do anything evil, but he can get something wrong because he's a human being just like we are. He can make mistakes and not be perfect in the sense of like being a superhuman being. He's perfect in the sense that he lives a life of perfect love, always in obedience to the Father. I love how the show demonstrates that, gives us all the knowledge that God's understanding of our weaknesses and our failings, that aren't failings of moral will, but failings of weakness of the body and of the mind that we have as human beings. Jesus understands that because he went through it himself. They are dressing Jesus to go out before the crowds. Love that idea of your mom helping you get dressed in the best way possible. And then Jesus references a prophecy in Isaiah 53:2. It says he had nothing in his appearance that we would desire him. So Jesus is very intentional about not drawing attention to himself through his appearance. But they say, hey, this is going to help people be able to see you against the backdrop of the stones and everything around you. So you need to put on this cloak. And they choose blue ultimately, which references, they say, the Prince of Peace concept, which is found in Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6, a clear prophecy of Jesus' birth. He is the Prince of Peace. Barnaby and Shula show up, always great comedy relief, always fun little characters, and they help Judas find his way to the disciples and to Jesus, where he meets Peter. Mary, I love the moment where she says that she wishes that Joseph could have seen this, and Jesus and her have this tender moment. I love that the show's not afraid to say, oh, hey, Joseph isn't here, and that's something that surely caused grief in Mary's life as well. And then, of course, we get this great reveal that this is Judas, and here he is right before the Sermon on the Mount takes place, the most important sermon of Jesus' life, and Jesus begins to speak as the crowd sits down. Beautiful moment. Not necessarily a huge fan of the stage, the curtain idea, but I understand for the concept of a film, of a TV show, makes sense to make it a little dramatic. The scene of Jesus sharing the Beatitudes with Matthew was surely the highlight of this episode. Just flashing back and forth between blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the meek, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, and seeing his followers, his disciples, living out those truths, and how Jesus is looking for those that the world has forgotten and the world doesn't see as valuable, and calling them valuable and making them his followers, was just an amazing touch of brilliance in the show that makes me forgive the whole curtain thing, because this was one of the best episodes the show has ever done, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.